Hey everyone, and welcome to week 2 of our discussion of political polarization, week 6 in the class overall. So, I want to talk a little about what we've seen, more recently. Obama very much ran on a rhetoric of unity in both 2008 and 2012, and while this seems to have worked well electorally, we saw polarization to continue to increase throughout the entire Obama time period. Mitch McConnell, who was the Republican Senate Majority leader at the time, was very open about saying, hey, if we make legislative compromises, it'll be good for Obama electorally, so let's not make any legislative compromises. And this was, a rational strategy in terms of getting elected, and a good way to highlight one of the problems that our current system creates, in that it has an institutional incentive for the minority party to just block whoever is the party of the presidency, because they're the ones who are going to mostly receive credit or blame for what happens during their time in office. Trump ran pretty openly on polarization, far more so than any president we had seen before, who to varying degrees almost all paid at least some rhetorical tribute to this idea of bipartisanship. One thing I want to point out is that I don't think this was as successful as it seems. Elections are rare events, and they're very important events, so it's very tempting to learn as much as possible from each one. But because they're so rare, it's also easy to overreact and overread. To me, the most interesting thing in some ways about the initial 2016 election is that it more or less went the way you would expect generic Democrat against generic Republican. I think based on polling, we might say that each party ran a weaker than possible, or a weaker candidate than they perhaps could have. On the other hand, had both parties run stronger candidates, we might have seen the exact same sort of outcome play out in terms of Republican winning, because it's been 8 years of Democratic presidency. And the economy was middling, not bad, but not great during the electoral time. So let's talk a little bit about political conflict. I really like sort of this notion that Drummond introduces of we have this idea, we have these two fundamental axes for conflict. One is who gets what, we could call it the economic axis, and the other is who are we as a nation. There's a very interesting book called Let Them Eat Tweets that essentially points out that within a democracy, most of the time there is some numerical advantage for the middle class and the less well off, in terms of if you have straight up votes, you would expect some degree of economic redistribution and thus a reduction in inequality, right? The beneficiaries of inequality are smaller in number than the people being harmed by it. So we do see that when politics is about economic identities, we wind up with reductions in inequality. However, the premise of Let Them Eat Tweets is that essentially over time, this was discovered electorally, and so parties that wanted to run on a position of non-redistribution needed to have some other issue that they could run on, right? And this is summarized playfully in the title as Let Them Eat Tweets, but the idea is let's change our rhetoric to talk about things other than economics, which is not to say that those things don't matter, by the way. I'm not saying everyone should vote only on economics all of the time. But I am saying that this is a real dynamic that we see not just in the U.S., but also in other countries as well. Let Them Eat Tweets focuses mostly on the U.S. and U.K. because the researchers write in English and read in English, and those are the ones they could study. But I would expect that this is a fairly generalizable finding in terms of inequality does in general benefit a smaller number of people. And thus, for a democracy to sustain inequality, it needs to not be the only issue that's being voted on. But then Drummond also, points out that part of what has made this so difficult is that these identities now have started to overlap. Although we do have a bit of a weird mix at the moment in terms of like right-leaning populism, right? So perhaps the economic identity does not fully mesh with the cultural identity, but partisan identity meshes with a bunch of other cultural identities right now, even if not with economic standing. Okay, so obviously one of the things that has to be in place for democracy to work is just some baseline level of agreement on the rules. One of the things that I found interesting, and I remember reading the paper I've linked to here back in grad school, so it's a little old, but it looks at this idea of like how isolated are we ideologically, and here it means like political ideologies. And note that like the top isolation is people you trust, and then like your family, your neighborhood, and your workplace, and then your voluntary associations. And you'll notice, so like these are all very much personal connections, right? I think we talk very much about polarization right now as like a social media phenomenon. Before that, as a cable news phenomenon. Before that, perhaps as a talk radio phenomenon, if you want to go back even farther in technology. But it turns out we are actually less ideologically segregated in most of those places than we are in our voluntary interpersonal, offline talk to friends scenarios, right? So this suggests, again, like I view this as pretty strong, well, I view this as a form of support for Druckmann's thesis that like what we are seeing is actually something institutional, right? Like it's not talk radio, it's not cable news, it's not social media. I'm not saying none of those things maybe accelerated this trend or played zero role, right? Like my goal is not to say, hey, all of these things are problem free. Like there are very real problems from all of these information media. But the fundamental problem of polarization would likely be there anyway, regardless of the information media that we use. And so, like, while there might be some benefits to tinkering with like how we communicate in terms of the medium, that by itself is not actually the thing that's going to like fix polarization. It does look like it comes down to this sort of institutional issue of what are the incentives for the parties, what are the incentives for people individually who in fact like hanging out with people who agree with them because it's easier. They have things in common, right? And we also see this sort of sorting where people who have things in common then also wind up having political views in common. Okay. That's all I wanted to say about those chapters in Druckmann. Really looking forward to the discussion this week. Thanks. Hope you all have a good week.